first time I moved something with my mind, I killed my little brother. Not intentionally, not with malice or forethought or any understanding of what I was doing. I was 14 years old, working the third shift in the nutrient processing plant on Hedros Prime, a hive world where the air tasted like copper and chemical waste, where sunlight was a myth told to children who would never see it. The sky above our hab block was a permanent shade of rust brown, thick with particulates from the manufactorums that ran day and night without pause. You could taste the metal in every breath. Feel it coating your lungs with each inhalation, building up over years until the consumption took you like it had taken our father, like it would eventually take all of us who worked the lower levels. My brother, Mikhail, was 11. Small for his age, thin from a childhood of corpse starch and recycled water that never quite tasted clean. His arms were stick-thin, his ribs visible through the threadbare work shirt they'd issued him when he turned 10 and became old enough for factory duty. We worked together on the sorting line, pulling corrupted protein blocks from the conveyor before they reached the grinder. The blocks came from the reclamation centers where they processed the dead, turning human remains into food for the living. Sometimes you could still see pieces that looked too much like what they'd been. A finger bone, part of a jaw with teeth still attached. We were supposed to pull those out, throw them into the secondary processing bin where they'd be ground finer, made unrecognizable. 12 hours at a time we stood at that line, 6 days a week. Every week of our short and meaningless lives. The only breaks were when the machinery needed maintenance or when someone collapsed from heat exhaustion in the sweltering plant. The temperature was always 40 degrees or higher because the processing equipment generated so much heat, and the overseers didn't waste resources on worker comfort. We had water dispensers every 50 meters, lukewarm fluid that tasted like the pipes it came through, rationed to 2 cups per shift, because even water wasn't free in the Imperium. The foreman that day was a bastard named Grent. Thick arms, thicker skull, a belly that spoke of access to real food instead of corpse starch, the kind of man who found pleasure in the suffering of children because children couldn't fight back. He wore the armband of the Departamento Munitorum, which meant he had authority over us workers, could dock our rations, or extend our shifts, or beat us if production numbers fell below quota. He'd been riding Mikkel for hours, ever since the shift started, screaming about efficiency ratings, about how the Emperor demanded perfection, about how worthless underhive scum were dragging down the processing numbers with their laziness. My brother was crying, trying not to show it, wiping his face with the back of his filthy hand, while his fingers kept moving, kept sorting, kept trying to meet the impossible numbers that Grent demanded. The quota had been raised again last month, always rising, never falling, because the Imperium needed more food for more soldiers, fighting in wars on worlds we'd never heard of against enemies we couldn't imagine. Every protein block we processed meant another guardsman could eat another meal before dying in some distant trench. Our suffering measured in grams of recycled human flesh. I'd been having the headaches for 6 months by then. Started as small things, pressure behind my eyes when I got angry or scared. Then came the voices, whispers at the edge of consciousness, in languages I didn't understand, speaking words that made my skin crawl and my stomach turn. Objects would move when I looked at them too hard. Shadows would twist into shapes that shouldn't exist. I knew what it meant. Everyone in the Imperium knew what it meant. I was becoming a witch, a psyker, one of those cursed with the ability to touch the warp and be touched by it in return. I'd been hiding it as best I could. Kept my head down, avoided eye contact, tried not to think too hard about anything because thinking seemed to make it worse. But the voices were getting louder. The pressure in my skull was building day by day like something inside me wanted to break free and didn't care what damage it caused in the process. I was terrified. Terrified of what I was becoming, terrified of what would happen when someone finally noticed, terrified of the black ships that everyone whispered about in the darkness of the hab blocks. Grent raised his hand. A shock rod, crude and heavy, crackling with blue electricity that cast strange shadows across his face. He was going to hit Mikkel. I could see it in his eyes, the anticipation, the sick joy of someone who enjoyed causing pain because it made him feel powerful in a life where he had almost no power at all. Mikkel saw it too, flinched backward, his hands still moving over the conveyor, even as his body tried to retreat from the coming blow. I wanted to stop him, wanted it with every fiber of my being, with an intensity that made the thing inside my head surge forward like a beast breaking its chain. The headache exploded into blinding pain. The voices screamed. The world went white and red, and then something invisible reached out from me, grabbed the shock rod, and yanked it backward so hard that Grant stumbled. The rod swung around in a wild arc, fast, too fast. Grant lost his grip and the thing flew through the air like it had been thrown by something much stronger than a fat foreman's grip. It spun end over end, the electrical discharge crackling and hissing, and the live end caught Mikkel in the temple just as he turned to see what was happening. The sound was meat hitting metal, organic material making contact with something harder than itself at high velocity. The smell came next, burning hair and cooking flesh, the particular odor of human tissue being destroyed by electrical current. Mikkel's body went rigid, back-arching, every muscle contracting at once as thousands of volts coursed through his small frame. Foam gathered at the corners of his mouth. His eyes rolled back until only the whites showed. He made a sound, something between a scream and a gurgle, and then he fell. The shock rod clattered to the concrete floor, still sparking, rolling until it came to rest against a support pillar. Mikkel lay in a spreading pool of his own fluids, body jerking with aftershocks, limbs twitching in random patterns that had nothing to do with conscious control. I could see the burn mark on his temple where the rod had made contact, the skin blackened and split, the white of bone visible underneath. His chest rose once, twice, then stopped moving entirely. I remember screaming. Remember the sound of my own voice echoing off the metal walls of the processing plant, mixing with the constant grinding of machinery and the shocked gasps of the other workers. I remember dropping to my knees beside Mikkel's body, reaching for him with hands that were shaking so badly I couldn't control them. His skin was still warm, his eyes were open, staring at nothing, the light in them already gone. The other workers backed away from me. I could see it in their faces, the horror and the fear mixing together, the realization of what I was written in their expressions as clearly as words on a page. They knew. They'd all seen the shock rod move on its own, seen the unnatural way it had been yanked from Grant's hand and sent flying through the air. They knew I was a witch, a psyker, a threat to everyone around me. In a hive world where witches were burned and psykers disappeared into the holds of black ships, I just revealed myself in the most public and permanent way possible. Grant was looking at me too. His face had gone from angry red to pale white, all the sick pleasure drained away and replaced with something that might have been fear but looked more like cold calculation. He was a bastard, but he wasn't stupid. He knew exactly what happened to people who harbored witches, who failed to report psychic manifestations to the proper authorities. He'd lose his position, his extra rations, possibly his life if anyone thought he'd been protecting me. His hand moved to the Vox unit clipped to his belt, fingers already reaching for the activation stud that would summon the Arbits. I ran. Didn't think about it. Didn't plan it. Just stood up and ran toward the emergency exits at the back of the plant. Behind me, I could hear Grant shouting, could hear the other workers scattering to get out of my way like I was contaminated, like proximity to a witch might infect them with whatever curse I carried. My boots slammed against concrete as I ran through corridors lined with pipes and machinery, taking turns at random, just trying to put distance between myself and the body of my brother, between myself and the consequences of what I'd done. I made it to the waste reclamation tunnels that ran beneath the processing plant. Dark passages that smelled like sewage and chemicals, lit only by emergency strips that had been failing for decades, never quite dark enough to hide in, but never bright enough to see clearly. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs wouldn't carry me any further, then collapsed against a wall and tried to think through the fog of panic and grief that filled my head. Mikkel was dead. I'd killed him. The thing inside me had reached out, and it had killed my little brother, and now he was gone forever, and there was nothing I could do to take it back. No amount of prayer or penance or sacrifice would bring him back. He was just gone, his body lying on the factory floor, and soon they'd process him like they processed all the dead, grinding him down into protein blocks that someone else would eat without knowing whose flesh they were consuming. I don't know how long I sat there. Hours, maybe. Long enough for my breathing to slow and my heart to stop racing quite so fast. Long enough for the reality of my situation to settle in like lead weights in my stomach. I was a witch. I'd manifested psychic powers. I'd killed someone with those powers. There was no coming back from this, no way to pretend it hadn't happened, no possibility of returning to my old life. The Arbits would be looking for me. The Psy Hounds would be hunting me. It was only a matter of time before they found me. They came for me that same night, though night was just a word on Hadros Prime, where the sun never really rose or set, where time was measured in work shifts in the eternal twilight of the lower hive. I heard them before I saw them, the sound of armored boots on concrete echoing through the tunnels, accompanied by a sound like wet breathing that made my skin crawl. The Psy Hounds, genetically engineered creatures with too many eyes and mouths that dripped something that wasn't quite saliva, their bodies twisted by Mechanicus breeding programs into forms optimized for hunting psychic signatures. I could feel them tracking me, not with my eyes or ears, but with something deeper, the psychic sense that had awakened when I'd killed Mikkel. The hounds were blanks, voids in the warp, empty spaces where consciousness should be but wasn't. Being near them felt like drowning, like trying to breathe water instead of air, like having something essential torn out of my chest. They made me want to vomit just from proximity, made every instinct scream at me to run, even though running was pointless. The Arbits followed behind the hounds, 6 of them in full riot armor, their faces hidden behind helmets that turned them into faceless instruments of Imperial law. They carried shock mauls and stub guns, weapons designed to subdue rather than kill because live psychers were valuable. Dead ones, just more protein for the reclamation centers. One of them had a vox horn, amplifying his voice until it echoed through the tunnels like the voice of the Emperor himself. Theron Malik, age 14, citizen designation Hadros Prime, 7794228. You're identified as manifesting unsanctioned psychic abilities. By order of Planetary Governor Hectus III and the authority of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, you are hereby claimed for the Imperial tithe. Resistance will result in immediate termination. Compliance will be rewarded with mercy. You have 30 seconds to surrender. I didn't move. Couldn't move. The Psy Hounds had formed a circle around me, 6 of them blocking every escape route, their too many eyes fixed on me with predatory focus. The Arbits advanced, shock mauls ready, moving with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this hundreds of times before. This was their job, hunting down witches like me, bringing us in for processing, making sure the Imperium got its tithe of psychers to fuel the Emperor's continued existence. They fitted me with restraints first, heavy metal cuffs that locked around my wrists and ankles, connected by chains that allowed me to shuffle, but not run. Then came the preliminary collar, a thick band of black material that went around my neck and immediately made my head feel stuffed with cotton. The voices didn't stop completely, but they got quieter, muffled, like someone had thrown a blanket over them. The pressure in my skull eased just slightly, enough that I could think almost clearly for the first time in months. They hauled me to my feet, dragged me through the tunnels toward the surface levels. The Psy Hounds followed, their wet breathing a constant reminder of what I'd become, what I would always be now. We emerged into the main hab block where I'd lived my entire life, where my mother and our neighbors could see me being led away in chains like a criminal, like the witch I was. My mother was waiting in the corridor outside our compartment. She must have heard what happened. Someone from the plant must have told her that her eldest son had manifested psychic powers and killed her youngest, that the Arbits were coming, that there was nothing she could do to stop it. She was a small woman, worn down by decades of hive life, her face prematurely aged by the chemicals we breathed and the constant struggle to survive on rations that were never quite enough. She didn't cry when she saw me, didn't scream or beg the Arbits to show mercy, just stood there with empty eyes, looking at me like I was already dead, like the son she'd raised had been replaced by something that wore his face but wasn't really human anymore. When the Arbites led me past her, she spoke. Just 3 words, quiet enough that I almost didn't hear them over the sound of boots and chains and the wet breathing of the Psyhounds. The Emperor protects. That was my goodbye. The only acknowledgement that I'd ever existed, that I'd been her son, that I'd mattered even in the smallest way. Then the Arbites were dragging me away and my mother was getting smaller behind me, and I knew with absolute certainty that I would never see her again, never see Hadros Prime again, never see anything familiar or comfortable or remotely resembling home for whatever time I had left before the Imperium consumed me completely. The holding facility was in the upper hive, levels I'd never visited before, where the air was cleaner and the architecture less corroded by centuries of industrial pollution. A squat building of ferrocrete and plasteel, surrounded by razor wire and guard towers, searchlights sweeping the perimeter in regular patterns. They brought me through gates that could have stopped a tank, down corridors lined with automated weapon systems, into processing rooms where servitors with dead eyes and mechanical limbs performed their functions with perfect efficiency. They stripped me naked first, took my work clothes, my boots, everything I owned, which wasn't much. Threw it all in an incinerator because objects touched by witches needed to be destroyed, needed to be purified by flame before they could contaminate anyone else. Then they hosed me down with water so cold it felt like being stabbed with icicles, scrubbing my skin raw with brushes that removed dirt and hair and the top layer of skin cells. They shaved my head, running electric clippers over my skull until I was bald, until I looked like every other prisoner waiting for the black ships. The tattooing came next. A servitor with needle fingers grabbed my arm, extended it, began carving numbers into my flesh in thick black ink that burned like acid. Not my name. Names didn't matter anymore. Just a designation, a catalog number, a way for the Imperium to track its property through the system. Hadros Prime 7794. 228 became 77942. 28 became 42. 28 became nothing but numbers and pain. Then they threw me in a cell with 40 other people. The cell was 6 meters by 8 meters, designed for maybe 10 people if you were being generous with space requirements. They'd packed 40 of us in there, all wearing the same gray prison shifts, all with shaved heads and hollow eyes, all psychers waiting for the black ship that would come eventually, maybe next week, maybe next month, maybe never if we died first from disease or malnutrition or just giving up. The smell hit me immediately. Unwashed bodies, human waste, fear sweat, the particular odor of people who'd stopped caring about hygiene because hygiene required hope, and hope was in short supply. Some of the prisoners were sitting against the walls, knees pulled up to their chests, staring at nothing. Some were pacing in the limited space available, 3 steps in one direction, turn, 3 steps back. Some were praying, whispered litanies to the Emperor that seemed to bring them comfort, even though the Emperor had allowed them to be thrown in this cell in the first place. I found a spot near the back corner and sat down. The floor was cold concrete, stained with fluids I didn't want to identify. Next to me was a woman, maybe 30 years old. with scars on her arms that looked self-inflicted, like she'd been trying to remove something beneath her skin. She was rocking back and forth, muttering under her breath, words in low Gothic mixed with something else, something that made my new collar buzz with warning against my throat. The collar. They'd fitted me with a permanent one during processing, replacing the temporary suppression band with something more sophisticated. Thicker, heavier, made of black silicate material that was warm against my skin, pulsing with whatever technology the Adeptus Astra Telepathica used to keep psychers controlled. The moment they'd activated it, everything changed. The voices stopped completely. The pressure in my head that had been building for months just vanished like someone had thrown a switch. But so did everything else. Colors faded to muted tones. Sounds arrived delayed and distant, like I was hearing them through water. My thoughts moved slowly, struggling through thick fog, unable to form complex ideas or hold on to memories for more than a few seconds at a time. I could still think, still function, but it was like my brain had been wrapped in layers of insulation, cutting me off from both the warp and from full consciousness. The other prisoners all wore the same collars. All had the same dulled expressions, the same difficulty focusing, the same struggle to maintain any sense of self under the constant suppression. We were being prepared, I realized, softened, made compliant. By the time the black ship arrived, we'd be docile enough to load into the holds without resistance, broken enough that we wouldn't cause problems during the journey to Terra. Food came twice a day, dispensed through a slot in the cell door. Nutrient paste in bowls made of compressed fiber, 200 grams per person, calculated to provide exactly enough calories to keep us alive without wasting resources on comfort or satisfaction. It tasted like nothing. Like eating paste made from cardboard and chemicals, but it was food and we were hungry, so we ate it. Water came from a fountain in the corner, lukewarm and metallic, rationed by timer to prevent anyone from taking more than their share. The toilet was a hole in the floor that drained to the reclamation system below. No privacy, no dignity, just a hole that everyone used while everyone else tried not to watch. Some of the prisoners had stopped caring, would relieve themselves wherever they were sitting, adding to the stench and the misery. Others maintained what dignity they could, waiting for moments when attention was elsewhere, trying to preserve some fragment of humanity in a situation designed to strip it away. I learned the rhythms of the cell over the next few days. Morning meal, then nothing for 12 hours. Evening meal, then darkness and the sounds of 40 people trying to sleep on a concrete floor with no blankets or padding. The guards came through twice daily, checking for dead bodies, removing anyone who'd stopped breathing during the night. Disease spread fast in the cramped conditions, infections and fevers that the Imperium didn't bother treating because dead psychers could be replaced and medical care cost resources that were better spent elsewhere. On the third day, an old man in the corner died from something that looked like pneumonia, coughing up blood until his lungs finally gave out. The guards dragged his body away without ceremony, without recording his name or acknowledging that a human being had died. They just hauled the corpse out like garbage and hosed down the floor where he'd been lying. 2 hours later, they brought in a new prisoner to replace him, a young woman who looked maybe 16, fresh from processing, still fighting the effects of her new collar. On the 5th day, someone tried to escape when the guards opened the door to deliver food. Just bolted for the opening, probably hoping to make it past them and down the corridor, even though there was nowhere to go, no way out of a facility designed to hold psychers until the black ships came. The guards beat him with shock mauls until he stopped moving, then dragged him away. We never saw him again. Don't know if they killed him or just moved him to solitary or fed him to the Psi hounds as punishment for trying to escape. The days became a blur of hunger and boredom and constant low-level despair. The collar made it hard to think clearly enough to be truly afraid, but underneath the suppression, I could feel the terror waiting, the knowledge of what was coming, where we were going, What happened to psychers claimed by the Imperium for the Great Tithe? Some prisoners talked about it in whispers during the dark hours, sharing rumors and half-truths about the black ships and terror and the Emperor's insatiable hunger for souls. Most of us would die, they said. The vast majority of psychers brought to Terra weren't strong enough or stable enough or useful enough to be trained as sanctioned psychers or astropaths or battle psychers. Most of us would be fed directly to the Golden Throne, our souls burned as fuel to keep the Emperor alive, to power the Astronomicon that allowed ships to navigate the warp. 1,000 psychers a day, they said. Every single day, for 10,000 years, millions upon millions of souls consumed, burned away like candles, their lives measured only in how many hours of power they could provide before being completely used up. It should have been terrifying, should have driven me mad with fear, but the collar muted even that, left me feeling detached and distant from my own fate, like I was reading about someone else's doom rather than facing my own. Maybe that was the point. Maybe the Imperium had learned that keeping psychers aware enough to be compliant, but sedated enough not to panic, was the most efficient way to process us through the system. On the 17th day, they came and told us the black ship had arrived. They moved us out in groups of 40, keeping us in the cells until the moment they needed us, then herding us through corridors at shock-maul point toward the loading bays. I shuffled along in my restraints, surrounded by other prisoners who looked as dulled and confused as I felt, all of us moving like sleepwalkers through spaces designed to strip away our last shreds of hope. The loading bay was massive, large enough to hold hundreds of prisoners and the transport vehicles that would carry us to the orbital stations. The noise was overwhelming, even through my collar-induced fog. Engines roaring, guards shouting orders, prisoners crying or praying or just making sounds that didn't form words. They packed us into transport trucks, heavy armored vehicles with no windows and minimal ventilation, 50 prisoners per truck, standing room only. The drive to the orbital lift took hours. The truck had no suspension to speak of, every bump and turn throwing us against each other, bruising already battered bodies. The air grew hot and stale, thick with carbon dioxide and the smell of fear. Some people fainted from the heat and lack of oxygen, their bodies held upright by the press of others around them until we reached our destination and they could fall properly. The orbital station was chaos. Thousands of prisoners being processed through checkpoints, loaded onto shuttles, catalogued by servitors who worked with mechanical efficiency. I caught glimpses through doorways of other holding pens, other groups of psychers waiting for transport, all of us bound for the same fate. The scope was staggering. This wasn't just Hadros Prime's tithe. This was a collection point for an entire sector, dozens of worlds sending their psychers to be gathered and shipped to Terra in one massive conveyance. And then I saw it through a viewport. The black ship. It hung in orbit like a piece of night itself, a void against the stars, black painted on black until it seemed to devour the light around it. Kilometers long, ancient beyond reckoning, covered in Gothic architecture and symbols in languages older than the Imperium. No running lights, no external illumination except the massive golden aquila on its prow that marked it as belonging to the Imperium of man. Just looking at it made me feel small, insignificant, completely disposable in the face of something so vast and terrible and old. The shuttle ride was shorter than I expected. The ship was in close orbit, close enough that the journey took less than an hour, even accounting for docking procedures. They packed 100 of us into a shuttle designed for 50, standing room only, barely enough oxygen to keep everyone conscious. When we docked, they drove us out through an airlock into corridors that were somehow darker than the inside of the shuttle, lit only by dim lumen strips spaced far enough apart that shadows pooled between them. The crew we passed didn't look at us. moved through their duties with the blank efficiency of people who'd learned to see psyker prisoners as cargo rather than human beings, who couldn't afford the psychological burden of acknowledging our humanity. They wore the uniforms of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, marked with symbols I didn't recognize, their faces showing the strain of service aboard a ship that generated constant soul-numbing despair just from existing. We descended deeper into the ship, down ramps and through passages that grew progressively older, the architecture shifting from Gothic to something more ancient, darker, built by people who'd understood that sometimes the best way to contain threats was to bury them so deep that escape became impossible. The temperature dropped as we descended, cold enough that I could see my breath, cold enough that some prisoners were shivering despite the crowd. And then we reached the hold. The doors were massive, 3 meters tall and reinforced with bars of metal thicker than my torso. They opened with a sound like grinding stone, revealing darkness beyond, absolute and complete except for the dim lumen strips that provided just enough light to see suffering without offering any hope of comfort. The smell rolled out like a physical wall, hitting me hard enough that I stumbled despite the collar's suppression. Unwashed bodies, human waste, fear sweat, disease, death, all of it concentrated in a space that held too many people with too little air and no possibility of escape. They pushed us forward, into the darkness, into the crowd, into hell. The hold was so vast I couldn't see the far walls, so packed with bodies that there was barely room to stand, let alone sit or lie down. Hundreds of psychers, maybe thousands, all wearing collars, all with the same dead eyes and slack faces, all waiting for the ship to fill completely before beginning the journey to Terra. The sound was overwhelming. Weeping, screaming, mad laughter, prayers delivered in dozens of languages, the constant background noise of human suffering compressed into acoustic form. I pushed deeper into the crowd, stumbling over people who were sitting or lying down, trying to find any space I could claim as my own. Bodies pressed against me on all sides, warm and damp and trembling. The air was thick, hard to breathe, heavy with moisture from so many people exhaling into limited space. The floor beneath my feet was wet with substances I didn't want to identify, slippery enough that I had to move carefully to avoid falling. Someone grabbed my arm. I flinched, tried to pull away, but their grip was strong despite the weakness that came from malnutrition and long imprisonment. "First time on a black ship?" The voice was male, rough with disuse, but still intelligible through the collar's fog. I nodded, unable to form words through the shock of transition from cell to hold. "I'm Reth. Was a scribe for the planetary governor on Tertius Secundus. Made a mistake in some casualty reports 3 years ago. Been in the system ever since, transferred from holding facility to holding facility, prison to prison. This is my 3rd black ship." He laughed, a sound utterly without humor. "They keep testing me, keep finding me not quite good enough for training, but not quite bad enough to sacrifice immediately. So I get passed along, cargo that nobody wants, but nobody can justify disposing of." He was old for the hold, maybe 50, though it was hard to tell with the toll that years of imprisonment took on human bodies. Thin to the point of emaciation, missing teeth, scars on his arms and face from fights or beatings. But his eyes still held intelligence, awareness, the stubborn refusal to give up completely that separated survivors from those who just waited to die. "What happens now?" I managed to ask, the words coming slowly through the mental fog. Reth gestured vaguely at the hold around us. "We wait. The ship visits world after world, collecting psychers as part of the Imperial tithe. Each stop brings more prisoners until the hold is completely full, packed so tight you can barely breathe. Could take months, maybe a year depending on the route. When it's full, the ship returns to Terra. They test us. The strong ones, the stable ones, they get trained as sanctioned psychers, maybe astropaths if they're lucky. The rest, he trailed off, looking away. The rest become fuel for the Emperor. Keep his throne powered, keep the Astronomicon burning, keep humanity alive for one more day. How many? Most of us. 9 out of 10 at least, maybe more. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica has high standards. You need to be powerful enough to be useful, stable enough not to go mad or get possessed, young enough to survive the training. Most psychers don't qualify. We're just raw material, souls waiting to be consumed. He said it without emotion, without anger, just stating facts that he'd had 3 years to accept. I wanted to feel something about this information. Terror, rage, despair. But the collar muted even that, left me feeling hollow and distant, like I was learning about someone else's fate rather than my own. "Come on," Reth said, pulling me toward the wall. "I'll show you how to survive. Won't make it pleasant, but might keep you alive until we reach Terra." He taught me the rules of the hold over the next few hours, the unwritten laws that governed life in this compressed nightmare. Stay near the walls where you could lean back against something solid. Avoid the center where people died from being crushed or suffocated. Make alliances quickly. Find people you could trust to watch your back when you needed to sleep or use the waste reclamation stations. Don't draw attention from the guards or the sisters who patrolled the hold, because attention meant beatings or worse. The food dispensers were set into the walls at regular intervals, crude devices that delivered nutrient paste twice daily. You had to fight your way through the crowd to reach them, then fight to keep your portion once you had it. The strong controlled access, demanding tribute or obedience in exchange for allowing weaker prisoners to feed. Reth had allies from previous stays in the hold, people who recognized him and were willing to share protection in exchange for his knowledge of how the system worked. He introduced me to 2 others. Elia was a woman in her 30s, former teacher from an agricultural world, captured when her powers manifested during a lesson. She'd been trying to explain the water cycle and accidentally made it rain inside her classroom, clouds forming against the ceiling and dropping real water on her confused students. The Arbits had come that same day, dragged her away while her students watched, probably terrified her into their nightmares forever. Jorik was younger, maybe 20, a factory supervisor who'd manifested his powers during an argument with a worker. He'd gotten angry, and the man had just dropped dead, brain hemorrhage, killed by psychic feedback that Jorik hadn't known he was generating. The look in Jorik's eyes said he'd replayed that moment constantly, the guilt eating him alive even through the collar's suppression. The 4 of us formed a unit, watched each other's backs, shared our meager rations, took turns sleeping so someone was always alert for threats. It wasn't friendship exactly, more like survival pact, acknowledgement that groups lasted longer than individuals, in conditions designed to break us down one by one. But it was better than facing the nightmare alone, better than dying without anyone noticing or caring. The ship made its first stop on the 31st day. I knew it was the 31st day because Reth kept count, scratching marks into the metal wall with a piece of broken plasteel he'd found. The entire ship shuddered as it dropped out of the warp, the sensation making everyone's stomach lurch even through the suppression of the collars. Hours later, the hold's main doors opened, and they brought in the new prisoners. 300 more psychers, fresh collars, fresh terror, fresh meat for the grinding machine of Imperial efficiency. They packed them into the already crowded hold, forcing those of us already there to squeeze tighter, to surrender space we'd barely had to begin with. The new arrivals were from a forge world, judging by the tattoos and augmetics some of them bore. Adeptus Mechanicus workers who'd manifested psychic abilities despite the tech priest's best efforts to screen them out during recruitment. Among the new prisoners was a child, a girl, maybe 11 years old, small enough that she had trouble keeping her footing in the pushing crowd. Dark hair shaved unevenly, eyes too intelligent for someone so young. the look of someone who'd learned early that the galaxy was cruel and the Imperium was crueler. She was crying quietly, the kind of tears that come from exhaustion and fear rather than hope that crying might bring help. Elia saw her and moved immediately, pushing through the crowd to reach the girl before someone else did. Not everyone in the hold maintained their humanity. Some prisoners had given up completely, become predators who took what they wanted from the weak because the guards didn't care what we did to each other as long as it didn't interfere with operations. A child alone was a target, someone who could be victimized, used, destroyed without consequence. "Come here," Elia said, her voice gentle despite the roughness from weeks without proper water. "Stay with us. We'll keep you safe." The girl followed without resistance, too scared to do anything else, probably recognizing that any protection was better than none. She pressed close to Elia, small body shaking, eyes darting around at the nightmare she'd been thrown into without warning or preparation. "What's your name?" Elia asked. "Sarah." Quiet voice, barely audible over the constant noise of the hold. "I'm from Tertius. I was a street performer, did tricks with cards and coins, made them float, made patterns in the air. People paid to watch until..." She trailed off, the memory too painful even through the collar's numbing. "Until they realized you were a witch," Elia finished. "Same as all of us. Same as everyone here." Sarah nodded, tears still running down her face. "They threw stones. Called for the Arbites. I ran, but the Psi hounds found me. Dragged me out of the hab block where I was hiding. Everyone watched. My friends, the people I performed for, all of them just watched while they took me away." "The Emperor protects," Reth said, his tone making clear what he thought of that particular platitude. "Does he?" Sarah asked, the question holding more weight than something a child should carry. "Because it doesn't feel like protection. Feels like we're being thrown away, used up, burned like trash." No one had an answer for that. Because she was right. The Emperor did protect, but he protected humanity as a whole, the species rather than the individual, and the price of that protection was measured in millions of souls, consumed every year to keep his throne powered and his empire functioning. We were that price, the fuel that kept the Imperium burning, and there was no mercy in it, no acknowledgement that what was necessary might also be monstrous. The ship continued its route through the sector, more stops every few weeks, more prisoners flooding into the hold until we were so tightly packed that breathing became difficult. The air grew thick with carbon dioxide and moisture, hot from so many bodies generating heat in enclosed space. People began dying regularly from heat exhaustion, from infections that spread through the unsanitary conditions, from simple despair that finally overcame the will to continue breathing. The guards removed the bodies during their twice-daily patrols, dragging corpses out through the crowd without ceremony or acknowledgement. Sometimes they'd been dead for days before anyone noticed, the crush of people holding them upright even after their hearts stopped. Sometimes we'd be talking to someone and only realize hours later that they hadn't responded, hadn't moved, had died standing up pressed between us. Sarah stayed with our group. Elia took her under protection like a daughter, sharing her sparse rations even though it meant she got less herself, told her stories in quiet voices during the dark hours when most prisoners were trying to sleep. Tales of worlds beyond the hive, of oceans and forests and skies that weren't choked with industrial smoke. Sarah listened with desperate hunger, clinging to the stories like lifelines, like proof that somewhere beauty still existed even if she'd never see it. Reth taught her the survival skills he'd learned over 3 years in the system. How to fight for food without drawing attention from guards, how to navigate the social hierarchies of the hold, recognizing which groups to avoid and which might offer temporary alliance. How to sleep standing up, body relaxed enough to rest, but awareness maintained enough to wake if threatened. how to preserve what dignity you could when forced to use the waste reclamation stations in full view of hundreds of other prisoners. Jorik was quieter, spent most of his time staring at nothing, lost in memories of the man he'd killed, the guilt still eating at him despite the collar's suppression. Sometimes he'd snap back to awareness and talk about his life before, about the factory he'd supervised, the workers he'd been responsible for, the simple satisfaction of producing goods that served the Imperium. But mostly, he was silent, slowly dying inside while his body kept functioning out of habit. The first purge happened on the 93rd day. A man near the center of the hold, someone I'd never spoken to but had seen in the shuffling crowds. His collar malfunctioned. Simple mechanical failure, the kind of thing that was inevitable when you put thousands of suppressors into constant use in harsh conditions. The device sparked, crackled, went dark. For a moment, his psychic abilities returned full force. All the power that had been building pressure under suppression suddenly freed without control or discipline. His eyes lit up with unnatural fire. He screamed, sound that hurt to hear even through my own collar, voice carrying frequencies that shouldn't exist in real space. The air around him began to twist, warp, reality bending in response to uncontrolled psychic energy. Other prisoners scrambled to get away, pushing and shoving in panic, crushing people against walls, trampling those who fell. The Sisters of Silence were on him in seconds. 3 of them moving through the crowd with superhuman speed, their null auras blazing bright enough that everyone within 10 meters was vomiting from the psychic pressure. They wore golden auramite armor that caught the dim light and turned it into something that hurt to look at directly. Their faces were uncovered, beautiful and cold and completely without mercy. They carried great swords, blades of unknown metal that were longer than I was tall, weapons designed to cut through anything, including the bodies of psychers whose powers made them dangerous to approach. The first sister reached the malfunctioning psyker and swung once. Perfect arc, blade moving so fast it blurred. His head came off his shoulders in a spray of blood that painted everyone nearby in crimson. The body fell, collapsing into the crowd, but the sisters didn't stop there. They killed everyone within 3 meters of the manifestation. Systematic purge, blades flashing in the dim light, cutting down prisoners who were already trying to run, to get away, to prove they weren't corrupted by proximity to uncontrolled psychic power. 20 people died in less than 2 minutes. Their screams mixed with the constant background noise of the hold, their blood soaking into the floor and the clothes of those lucky enough to be just beyond the killing zone. Then the sisters stopped, surveyed the carnage with empty eyes, confirmed that the threat was eliminated, that no corruption had spread beyond the immediate area. They turned and walked away, boots splashing through blood and waste, leaving behind bodies and trauma in the survivors who would have to live with what they'd witnessed. I was 10 meters away, close enough to see everything in horrible detail, close enough to smell the blood in the voided bowels of the dead, far enough to survive, barely, protected by the arbitrary boundary that the sisters had drawn around the corruption. Sarah vomited after that, her small body heaving until there was nothing left in her stomach, just dry heaving into the darkness, while Elia held her and whispered comfort that rang hollow. Jorik stared at the bodies, his face blank with shock, hands trembling. Reth started scratching new marks into the wall, counting the dead, keeping track because someone had to remember, even if remembering served no purpose. The ship entered the warp on the 107th day, and everything got worse. The warp was the Imperium, a dimension of pure psychic energy that underlay real space like an ocean beneath the world. Ships traveled through it because there was no other way to cover the vast distances between stars in anything resembling reasonable time. Geller fields created bubbles of reality that protected crew and passengers from the nightmare realm beyond, from the demons and horrors that lived in a place where thought had form and emotion could kill. but psychers could feel the warp even through Gellar fields and collars and psi-shielded holds. It pressed against my consciousness like weight, like drowning in something thicker than water, like standing at the edge of infinite darkness and knowing that things in that darkness could see you even if you couldn't see them. The nightmares started immediately. Dreams that weren't dreams, visions that leaked through suppression, fragments of things that wanted in. Everyone in the hold felt it. Thousands of psychers all sensing the warp outside the hull, all generating psychic signatures that blazed like beacon fires in the darkness, drawing attention from entities that fed on souls and emotions. The whispers returned despite the callers, voices speaking in languages that shouldn't exist, promises and threats delivered in tones that made skin crawl and sanity crack at the edges. The children were worst off. Sarah clung to Elia with desperate strength, eyes wide and dark, seeing things that I could only catch glimpses of at the corner of my vision. Shadow that moved wrong, shapes that existed in too many dimensions, faces pressing against reality from the other side, trying to find ways through, seeking weakness in the barriers that separated Materium from Imperium. The possession happened on the 9th day of warp transit. Another collar malfunction at the worst possible moment during the time when barriers were thinnest, when the ship's Gellar field was under maximum stress from navigating the Empyrean currents. A man 30 meters away, his collar sparking and dying, his mind suddenly open to the full force of the warp without any protection or preparation. The demon came through immediately. Not gradually, not slowly, but instant possession, an entity of pure malevolence wearing human flesh, like an ill-fitting suit. The man's body went rigid, joints bending in directions they shouldn't, bones breaking and reforming, flesh rippling and splitting to allow things through that had no place in 3 dimensions. His mouth opened wider than jaws should allow, wide enough to show throat and spine and things beyond that, and the sound that came out wasn't human vocalization. It was glass breaking and metal screaming and the death cries of galaxies compressed into something approximating speech. Words that carried meaning without language, that infected every mind that processed them with fragments of corruption. He began to change visibly. Claws erupted from his fingers, black and sharp and weeping some fluid that steamed when it hit the floor. His spine bent backward until it snapped audibly, but he didn't fall, just stood there, twisted and impossible, while the demon wearing him laughed with voices that hurt to hear. The sisters came, but they were slower this time, movement impeded by the effects of warp transit on the ship's systems. 3 of them pushing through the crowd, null auras blazing so bright that prisoners were collapsing just from being near them, their weapons drawn, moving with the kind of coordination that came from centuries of practice and gene engineering. The demon was fast, impossibly fast. It moved like thought, like the moment between 1 second and the next, claws lashing out to catch the first sister across her chest. The auramite armor that should have been impenetrable tore like paper, golden metal parting to allow black claws through, cutting deep into flesh beneath. The sister went down in a spray of blood that looked too dark, too thick, blood that hissed when it hit the floor. The second sister lunged, her great sword cutting through the possessed man's arm, severing it cleanly at the shoulder. But the demon didn't care about the body it inhabited, didn't care about damage to mere flesh. It grew new appendages from the stump, things made of warp energy and tortured meat, and struck again with strength that should have been impossible. The third sister had a different weapon. Not a sword, but something that looked like a lantern, ancient technology that glowed with sick green light that hurt to look at directly, that made reality twist and bend around it. She raised it high and spoke words in a language that might have been high Gothic but felt older, more primal, words that carried power beyond mere meaning. The green light flared so bright it illuminated the entire hold for a brief moment. I saw everything in that light, every prisoner, every body rotting in corners, every stain of blood and waste, every expression of terror and despair, and the stubborn refusal to die that kept thousands of us breathing despite the horror. And I saw the demon screaming as the light consumed it, burning away corruption, reducing the possessed body to ash that scattered in the recycled air. The purge that followed was worse than any previous one. The sisters killed everyone within 10 meters of the manifestation. 63 people cut down in minutes, proximity to corruption enough to warrant immediate execution. Some of them begged, pleaded that they weren't tainted, that they'd been far enough away. The sisters didn't respond, didn't acknowledge the pleas, just swung their blades with mechanical efficiency until no one in the designated kill zone remained alive. The injured sister died 3 hours later, bleeding out despite whatever medical attention they gave her. We could hear her sisters around her body, signing to each other in a language we couldn't understand, but whose meaning was clear anyway. They would carry her to wherever they stored their dead, would record her name in whatever rolls they kept, would replace her equipment and continue their duties because the ship needed protection and sentiment was a luxury no one could afford. The warp transit lasted 17 days total, 17 days of nightmares and whispers and the constant pressure of things trying to get in. By the time the ship dropped back into real space, emerged from the Emperium into normal physics, we'd lost another 100 prisoners. Some to possession and purges, some to suicide, throwing themselves at the sisters' swords rather than endure another moment. Some just died, hearts stopping or brains shutting down, psyches broken by exposure to things human minds weren't designed to comprehend. Sarah had changed. She didn't cry anymore, didn't speak much, just stared at nothing with eyes that had seen too much. Elea tried to reach her but couldn't. The child had gone somewhere deep inside herself where the horrors couldn't touch her. Jorik was barely functional, moved like a servitor, responded when told to but showed no initiative or awareness beyond immediate survival. Reth and I were the only ones still maintaining anything like sanity, and even that was questionable. The ship made more stops over the next months. Each time new prisoners flooded in. Each time more people died from disease or despair. The turnover was constant, mechanical, a grinding process that consumed human beings without acknowledgement. The hold grew more crowded with each stop, packed tighter than should have been possible, until we were sleeping standing up, pressed so close to each other that individual space became meaningless. Food and water were reduced as the population grew. The same number of dispensers serving more people meant smaller portions, meant fighting became more vicious, meant the weak died faster because they couldn't compete. The waste reclamation systems backed up constantly, unable to handle the volume, leaving pools of filth that we had to navigate or stand in. The smell became so bad that you stopped noticing it, your nose just shutting down to avoid processing information that would make you vomit. Disease was rampant, infections spreading through the cramped conditions faster than prayer could ward them off. Respiratory illnesses from the bad air, skin diseases from the filth, things that had no name but killed anyway, fevers and seizures and slow deterioration. The guards removed bodies daily but couldn't keep up with the death rate. Sometimes corpses would stay propped up in the crowd for days before anyone noticed they'd stopped breathing. Jorik died on what I thought was the 543rd day, though I'd lost count and the number was probably wrong. Just stopped breathing sometime during the night, heart giving out, body giving up. He was standing between Reth and me, pressed so close I could feel his warmth, and then gradually he went cold, and I realized he'd been dead for hours and neither of us had noticed. We moved him to the nearest body collection point, where his corpse would be processed into protein paste, his life reduced to calories that would feed other prisoners. Sarah died 6 days later. Just lay down in the filth and refused to stand again, refused to eat, refused to respond to Elia's desperate pleas. She was 11 years old. She'd performed tricks on street corners for spare credits. She dreamed of better life before the Arbits took her, and she died in the hold of a black ship, surrounded by thousands of other people, alone despite the crowd, used up by a system that viewed her as fuel rather than human. Elia broke after that. Stopped talking, stopped moving except when absolutely necessary, just stared at the space where Sarah had died like she could, will the child back to life through sheer force of grief. I tried to reach her but couldn't. She'd given up, surrendered, decided that death was preferable to one more day in this hell. 3 weeks later, she was dead too, heart attack or stroke or just loss of will. I didn't know which, and it didn't matter. That left Reth and me, 2 survivors out of a group that had been 5, 2 people still functioning out of thousands who'd been in the hold when I first arrived. The mathematics of attrition played out in human lives, calculated in bodies removed and spaces filled by new prisoners who would die in their turn. We didn't talk much anymore. Conversation required energy we didn't have. Mental clarity the collars made impossible. We just existed in proximity, 2 points of awareness in an ocean of suffering, keeping each other sane through simple presence. Sometimes Reth would tell me fragments of his old life, memories of being a scribe, of organizing information, of the satisfaction of work done well. Sometimes I'd talk about Hadros Prime, about Mikkel, about the guilt that still sat in my chest despite everything else that had happened. Mostly we were silent, conserving resources, surviving one more day, one more hour, one more breath in the eternal darkness of the hold. The announcement came on what might have been the 684th day. A Vox system crackling to life, a voice distorted by static and distance delivering words that everyone had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Final approach to Sol system authorized. All cargo prepare for transfer to Scholastica Psychana. Processing facilities. The Emperor protects. Terra, the throne world. The cradle of humanity transformed into a planet-sized fortress. Home to the Golden Palace and the Emperor himself and all the vast machinery of administration that ruled 1,000,000 worlds. We were finally at the end of the journey. For most of us, it would be the last world we ever saw. The transfer happened in stages over the next 3 days. They herded us out of the hold in groups of 200 through corridors that seemed impossibly bright after so long in darkness. My eyes watered. Couldn't adjust to normal lighting levels, turned everything into a blur of white and shadow. I stumbled along in restraints, surrounded by other prisoners who were equally disoriented, all of us shuffling like the walking dead through passages that smelled of recycled air and disinfectant. They processed us again in transfer stations, checking our numbers against manifests, confirming identities, cataloging us like cargo being moved from one warehouse to another. The tech priests who handled this work were more machine than flesh. Augmetic limbs clicking and whirring, vocal cords replaced by vox units that turned their voices into pure monotone. They spoke about us like we weren't there, discussing numbers and quotas and processing efficiency without acknowledging that we could hear them, that we were conscious beings rather than inventory. The first glimpse of terror came through a viewport in one of the transfer stations. I pressed my face against the reinforced plasteel, trying to comprehend what I was seeing through eyes that had spent nearly 2 years in darkness. The planet below was brown and gray, covered in urban sprawl that stretched from horizon to horizon without break. Hive cities that made Hadros Prime look like a mining outpost. Orbital platforms chained together in rings that circled the entire world. Industrial complexes the size of continents, and over everything, a haze of pollution so thick it was visible from orbit, yellow-brown clouds that turned the sky into something toxic and dead. This was the birthplace of humanity, the world where our species had originated, where the Emperor had first unified Terra during the Age of Strife, where he'd launched the Great Crusade that had conquered the galaxy. And it looked like a corpse, A world that had died millennia ago but refused to stop functioning, its cities built on layers of previous cities going back thousands of years, bones stacked on bones until the weight of history threatened to crush everything beneath it. The shuttle ride down through the atmosphere took 4 hours, navigating through layers of pollution and orbital traffic that made the pilot curse in low Gothic. The turbulence was severe, the shuttle shaking hard enough that prisoners were thrown against each other, that some people vomited from motion sickness. Through the small viewports, I could catch glimpses of the planet below. Mountains of metal and stone. Rivers that ran black with chemical runoff. Forests of spires and towers reaching up through the smog toward a sun that was barely visible through the atmospheric filth. We landed at a facility so massive I couldn't comprehend its scale. The landing pad alone was larger than entire districts of Hadros Prime, capable of accommodating hundreds of shuttles simultaneously. Guard towers rose at regular intervals, manned by soldiers in carapace armor carrying weapons that looked designed to kill space marines rather than unarmed prisoners. Walls surrounded the facility, 30 meters high and topped with razor wire and automated gun emplacements. They marched us through gates that could have held back armies, through courtyards where thousands of other prisoners were being processed, into buildings that dated back to before the Imperium existed. The architecture was ancient beyond comprehension. Stone carved with symbols in languages that predated human spaceflight. Columns that had stood for 10,000 years, supporting roofs that had sheltered the Emperor's earliest servants. This was the city of Sight, headquarters of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, the organization responsible for finding and training and sacrificing every psyker in the Imperium. The buildings rose around us in spires that vanished into the toxic clouds overhead, decorated with statues of saints and psykers and the Emperor himself. All of them looking down on the lines of prisoners shuffling toward judgment, their stone faces showing no mercy, no compassion, just the cold certainty that our suffering served the Imperium and therefore had meaning beyond our individual lives. The testing facility was clinical, sterile, utterly without ornamentation or comfort. White walls, harsh lighting, the smell of disinfectant and ozone. They moved us through in assembly line fashion, processing hundreds per hour, thousands per day. Each stage of assessment took only minutes, experienced administrators making judgments about our lives with the same efficiency they might use to sort cargo. First came the physical examination. Servitors with needle fingers drew blood, took tissue samples, catalogued our bodies for signs of corruption or mutation. They measured bone density, muscle mass, organ function, determining whether our physical forms were suitable for training or whether they'd break down under the stress of sanctioning. Most prisoners failed this stage immediately, bodies too damaged by years of malnutrition and disease in the black ship's holds. Next came the psychic assessment. They strapped us into thrones covered with sensors and neural interfaces, removed our collars for the first time in nearly 2 years. The rush of psychic awareness was overwhelming, like being blind and suddenly gaining sight, except what I saw was terrible beyond description. The warp pressed against reality here on Terra, held back by the Emperor's psychic might, but always pushing, always trying to break through. I could feel him, the God Emperor, his presence so vast it crushed my consciousness like an insect under a boot. Every psyker on Terra felt him, felt his mind blazing like a star that had been burning for 10 millennia, consuming soul after soul to maintain its light, felt his suffering, the agony of sitting on the golden throne with his body rotting while his consciousness fought an eternal war against chaos. Felt the weight of the Astronomicon, the great psychic lighthouse he maintained, the beacon that allowed ships to navigate the warp and kept the Imperium connected across 1 million worlds. It was too much, too vast, too terrible. I wanted to scream, but my throat wouldn't work. Wanted to look away, but there was nowhere to look that didn't contain his presence. For 10 eternal minutes, they measured my psychic strength, my resistance to corruption, my ability to maintain consciousness while exposed to the full force of the Emperor's psychic weight. When they finally replaced the collar, the relief was so intense I wept, grateful for the return of the dulling fog that made thought difficult, but at least made existence bearable. The psychological evaluation came last. Questions delivered in high Gothic by sanctioned psychers whose eyes were milky with cataracts, whose bodies bore the scars of the soul-binding ritual that allowed them to use their powers safely. They probed my memories, saw everything I'd experienced, saw Mikkel dying, saw the months in the Black Ship's hold, saw the deaths of Jorik and Sarah and Elia, saw the guilt and the trauma and the desperate desire for any kind of redemption, any meaning in the suffering. They compiled their assessment in minutes, cross-referenced my psychic strength with my psychological stability, calculated my age, my physical condition, my potential usefulness to the Imperium. The conclusion was delivered by a tech priest in high Gothic that I barely understood, but the summary was clear enough. Subject designation 4228. Psychic rating Theta grade. Physical condition marginal. Psychological profile shows guilt trauma and insufficient willpower for sanctioning. Age 17. Acceptable but not optimal. Assessment unsuitable for combat roles, unsuitable for astropathic training, unsuitable for sanctioned service. Recommendation: immediate transfer to Astronomicon processing facility for sacrifice. The Emperor protects. That was it. 3 minutes of assessment. 17 years of life reduced to a series of measurements and calculations. I was fuel, nothing more. My psychic potential was sufficient to be useful but not remarkable. My body was damaged but still functional. My mind was broken, but that didn't matter because I wouldn't need it much longer. The Imperium had determined my value, and my value was measured in how many hours of power I could provide to the Golden Throne before being completely consumed. They led me out through a different door than the one I'd entered. Down corridors that grew progressively older as we descended, the architecture shifting from Gothic to something more ancient, stone that predated the Imperium entirely. These tunnels had existed since the Dark Age of technology, built by people who'd achieved wonders we could no longer replicate, who'd built a civilization that had burned itself to ash during Old Night, leaving only ruins for the Imperium to build on top of. The walls were no longer carved or decorated, just rough stone, ancient beyond measure, lit by bioluminescent fungus that grew in cracks and crevices. The air was cold, damp, heavy with the weight of millennia pressing down from above. We walked for what felt like hours, descending deeper into the earth, following passages that wound through the bones of Terra itself. I was in a group of maybe 200 psychers, all of us condemned, all wearing collars, all surrounded by armed guards whose faces showed nothing. No pity, no anger, no acknowledgement that we were human beings rather than resources. We were the daily sacrifice, the 1,000 souls burned to keep the Emperor alive. We were necessary. We were valuable. We were completely expendable. Reth was beside me. We'd been separated during processing, but reunited in the corridor, drawn together by recognition, by the bond of shared suffering. He looked worse than I'd ever seen him, 3 years in the system having stripped away everything except the bare minimum needed to keep breathing, but he was still conscious, still aware, still maintaining some fragment of the man he'd been before the Imperium decided he was more useful as fuel. I kept hoping, he said quietly, his voice rough with disuse. 3 years I kept hoping they'd find me useful for something other than this. Kept thinking maybe next assessment they'd see value in my education, my experience, my willingness to serve, but it was always the same result. Not quite good enough for training, not quite bad enough to sacrifice immediately. Just passed along like cargo nobody wants. Does it hurt? I asked. The sacrifice? I don't know. Nobody who goes through it comes back to tell us. He laughed, sound utterly without humor. Maybe it's quick. Maybe it's agony that lasts forever. Maybe we don't feel anything at all, just stop existing and never know the difference. Does it matter? It didn't matter. We were going to die regardless. The method was irrelevant, the pain was irrelevant, everything was irrelevant except that we would cease to exist and the Imperium would continue functioning and humanity would survive one more day because we'd been burned as fuel. That was the only meaning our lives had, the only purpose we'd ever serve. The chamber they brought us to was vast beyond comprehension. A space so large it had its own weather system, condensation forming on the distant ceiling and falling as rain on the thousands below. The walls were lined with machinery that predated human understanding, devices built by the Emperor during the Great Crusade, maintained by the Adeptus Mechanicus, but never truly understood, just kept functional through ritual and prayer and replacement of parts when they failed. In the center of the chamber stood a structure that hurt to look at directly. Something that existed partially in real space and partially in the warp. A device that created a bridge between the two dimensions. Through it, psychic energy could be channeled from this chamber to the Golden Throne kilometers away in the heart of the Imperial Palace. Through it, our souls would be burned, our consciousness consumed, our life force transformed into power that would keep the Emperor alive for one more day. Tech priests moved through the chamber in robes that hid their augmetic bodies, their voices modulated to pure machine code, their movements precise and ritualistic. They were preparing the machinery, calibrating systems, ensuring everything functioned within acceptable parameters. To them, we weren't people. We were input, raw material, fuel to be processed. They would mourn our deaths no more than an engine operator mourns the promethium burned to power his machines. They lined us up in rows, 200 psychers arranged in geometric patterns that probably had some significance I couldn't comprehend. The guards removed our restraints, but kept weapons trained on us, ready to kill anyone who tried to flee or fight or do anything except accept their fate with proper Imperial compliance. Not that fleeing was possible. Where would we go? This chamber was kilometers beneath the surface of Terra, accessible only through passages guarded by soldiers and servitors and the Sisters of Silence whose null auras made escape psychologically impossible. The sisters were here now, standing at regular intervals around the chamber's perimeter, their golden armor catching the harsh lighting from overhead. 30 of them at least, maybe more, enough to contain any psychic manifestations that might occur when the collars were removed. Their presence was a physical weight, null auras washing over us in waves that made my stomach turn and my head ache, even through the collar's suppression. A tech priest approached the front of our group, his vox unit crackling with distortion as he spoke in High Gothic. I only understood fragments, but other prisoners translated in whispers, passing the message back through the rows. You have been selected for the highest honor any psyker can receive. You will serve the Emperor directly, fueling his divine consciousness, powering the Astronomicon that guides humanity through the darkness of the void. Your sacrifice ensures the Imperium's survival. Your deaths have meaning beyond your comprehension. Accept this fate with gratitude. Submit to this honor with proper humility. The Emperor protects through your burning. Glory to the Golden Throne, glory to the Master of Mankind, glory to the Imperium eternal. It was supposed to be comforting, I think. Supposed to give our deaths meaning, make us feel like heroes rather than victims, but I felt nothing except hollow acceptance. This was the end. There was no escape, no reprieve, no miracle that would spare us. We would die here in this chamber, and the universe would continue without noticing our absence. They began removing collars, working row by row, tech priests and servitors moving with mechanical efficiency. When they reached my row, pulled the suppressor from my neck, The return of psychic awareness was like being hit by lightning. Everything flooded back at once. The voices, the pressure, the connection to the warp that I'd been born with and cursed for having. But more than that, I could feel the Emperor. Not from a distance like during the assessment. Not filtered through barriers and suppression. I could feel him directly, his presence so vast it filled my consciousness completely, crushed everything else beneath its weight. He was in agony. 10,000 years of suffering, his body rotting on the golden throne while his mind fought an endless war against the forces of chaos. Every moment of every day for 100 centuries he'd been burning, consuming psychers' souls by the thousand to maintain his existence and his power. I could feel the other psychers around me, their minds opening like flowers as their collars were removed, all of us suddenly connected through the warp. I could feel their terror, their resignation, their desperate hope that maybe death would bring peace, that maybe service to the Emperor would redeem whatever sins we'd committed by being born with psychic gifts. 200 minds, all blazing bright with psychic energy, all about to be consumed. The tech priests began the ritual. Words in High Gothic mixed with machine code, mixed with something older, languages that predated human space flight. Prayers to the Omnissiah and the Emperor delivered in voices that were more synthetic than organic. The machinery activated, humming with power I could feel in my bones, in my soul, in the parts of me that existed in the warp as much as real space. The psychic pressure began to build. A gravitational force pulling at my consciousness, trying to draw it out of my body and into the device that would channel it to the golden throne. I could feel the same pull affecting everyone around me, 200 souls being extracted simultaneously, harvested like crops, processed like resources. The pain started gradually. Not physical pain, but something deeper, something that attacked consciousness itself. My sense of self began to fragment, pieces of my identity peeling away like layers of skin. I forgot my designation, forgot the hold of the black ship, forgot Hadros Prime and the nutrient processing plant, forgot everything except the immediate present, this moment, this sensation of dissolution. Reth was beside me, his consciousness blazing bright as his collar's suppression ended. I could feel his thoughts mixing with mine, boundaries between individuals becoming meaningless as we were pulled together toward the burning light of the Emperor. He was thinking about his work as a scribe, about the satisfaction of organizing information, about 3 years of suffering finally ending one way or another. He was grateful, I realized. Grateful that the waiting was over, that uncertainty had been replaced with terrible finality. The pull became irresistible. My consciousness separated from my body like oil separating from water, floating upward toward the machinery that would channel us to the golden throne. I could see my body below, empty now, collapsing without the animating force of consciousness to keep it upright. Around me, 200 other bodies were falling, all of us departing our flesh simultaneously, drawn toward the Emperor's hunger. The transition through the device was instant and eternal. A moment that stretched into subjective forever, consciousness existing in a state between dimensions, touching the warp directly without any protection or preparation. I could see things in that space. Demons pressing against reality, hungry for the psychic energy we represented. Worse things, entities so vast that human comprehension couldn't process their true forms, and the Emperor, blazing like a star in the darkness, his psychic might holding back horrors that would have destroyed humanity millennia ago if not for his sacrifice. We merged with him. 200 souls flowing into one consciousness so vast it could barely acknowledge our individual existence. Our life force was transformed into power, feeding the Golden Throne's machinery, sustaining the Emperor's continued existence, providing fuel for the Astronomicon that burned bright enough to be seen across the galaxy. I felt myself dissolving. Identity fragmenting into component pieces, memories scattering, everything that made me Theron Malik of Hadros Prime breaking apart and being consumed. I tried to hold on, tried to maintain some sense of self, but it was like trying to hold water in cupped hands. Everything drained away despite my efforts. In the final moments before individual consciousness ceased completely, I thought about Mikhail, about his face when the shock rod hit him, about the guilt I'd carried for nearly 2 years. I thought about Reth and Elia and Sarah and Jorik, about the small moments of kindness in the hold of the Black Ship, about the reminder that even in darkness, humans could maintain some fragment of dignity. I thought about my mother's empty eyes, about Grent the foreman and the nutrient processing plant and the endless days of sorting corpse starch on conveyor belts. About a life lived in service to the Imperium without ever understanding what that service meant, without comprehending the vast and terrible machinery that ground human beings into resources, without acknowledgement of suffering or sacrifice. And then I thought nothing at all. My consciousness scattered into the Astronomicon, becoming part of the great psychic lighthouse that guided ships through the warp. No longer individual, no longer suffering, no longer anything except energy and purpose. A component in the vast machine that kept humanity alive in a galaxy that wanted nothing more than to watch us die. The light was brilliant, blinding. Not physical light, but psychic radiance. The combined consciousness of 1,000 psychers being channeled across thousands of light years. We became the beacon, losing everything we'd been to serve a function we'd never fully understand. Burning bright and fast, our souls consumed in minutes or hours or days, time becoming meaningless in a state that was neither life nor death. There was a transcendence to it, if you looked at it from the right angle. We were serving the Emperor directly, doing exactly what he needed from us, fulfilling a purpose that kept the Imperium functioning. Our deaths allowed trade between worlds, allowed military coordination across sectors, allowed humanity to remain connected despite the vast distances that separated our million worlds. Without the Astronomicon, without the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers, the Imperium would fracture and humanity would die in isolated pockets across the galaxy. So our suffering had meaning, our deaths mattered, we were necessary. But we were also victims, taken from our homes, our families, everything we knew, processed through a system that viewed us as resources rather than people, transported in conditions designed to break us, to make us compliant, to strip away our humanity until nothing remained except psychic potential waiting to be harvested. The Imperium took children, broke them, burned them, and called it holy, called it necessary, called it the only way humanity could survive. And maybe it was. Maybe there was no alternative, no better path, no way to keep the species alive without sacrificing its most vulnerable members. Maybe the Emperor's suffering justified our suffering, his 10,000-year agony making our brief pain seem trivial by comparison. Maybe the survival of trillions justified the death of millions, the mathematics of population making individual lives irrelevant in the face of species-wide survival. Or maybe it was just horror. Horror given form and structure and religious justification. Horror built into the foundation of the Imperium, so fundamental to how the system worked that questioning it was heresy, that suggesting alternatives was treason, that acknowledging the human cost was weakness that couldn't be afforded. I don't know which truth was real. Both, maybe. Neither. It didn't matter because I was gone. Consciousness scattered across the warp, identity dissolved into light and energy. There was no me anymore to question or understand or judge. Just power flowing through ancient machinery, sustaining the Emperor for one more day, burning bright until nothing remained except ash and the need for new fuel. Somewhere above, in the chambers of the Scholastica Psychona, they were processing the next group, testing them, sorting them, separating the useful from the expendable. Tomorrow, another black ship would arrive with another cargo of psychers claimed from worlds across the Imperium. Tomorrow, another 1,000 souls would be burned to keep the Golden Throne powered and the Astronomicon shining. The cycle was eternal. The hunger was endless. The machine required feeding and would continue requiring feeding for as long as the Imperium existed, for as long as humanity fought its desperate war for survival against the darkness. This was my life. This was my death. This is the horrible fate of every psyker claimed by the black ships, every soul burned to feed the Emperor's insatiable hunger, every individual crushed beneath the weight of a system that cannot afford mercy or hesitation or any acknowledgement that what it does might be monstrous. But monstrosity is relative. In a galaxy where chaos gourds devour entire worlds, where alien empires wage wars of extinction, where humanity teeters on the edge of annihilation every moment of every day, maybe the black ships are mercy. Maybe being burned as fuel is preferable to the alternatives. Maybe the Imperium's brutal efficiency is the only thing standing between humanity and complete destruction. The Emperor protects, and we are the price of his protection. We are the fuel that keeps him burning. We are the sacrifice that allows humanity to survive one more day in the darkness. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, there is only war, only suffering, only the endless grinding of human lives into components that serve the Imperium's vast machinery. There is no hope for better, no dream of peace, no possibility of change. There is only service, only sacrifice, only the terrible knowledge that your suffering means something, even if that meaning is measured in hours of power provided to a god emperor who barely notices your existence. This is the truth the Imperium doesn't speak aloud. This is the cost that citizens aren't allowed to comprehend. This is the foundation on which the greatest empire in galactic history has been built, bones stacked on bones, souls burned as tinder, human consciousness reduced to fuel in a war that will never end. I was Theron Malik of Hadros Prime. I killed my brother with psychic powers I didn't understand. I spent nearly 2 years in the hold of a black ship, watching people die, losing everyone I cared about, slowly being broken by a system designed to prepare me for consumption. I was assessed, found wanting, deemed suitable only for sacrifice, and I died in the chambers beneath Terra. My soul burned to power the Astronomicon, my life measured in how many hours of light I could provide before being completely consumed. This was my fate. This is the fate of every psyker born in the Imperium. This is the horrible life of a slave in a black ship. From discovery to capture to transport to assessment to sacrifice. Every stage designed for efficiency. Every moment calculated to extract maximum value from human resources. Every death justified by the mathematics of survival. The Emperor protects, but his protection requires fuel. Requires sacrifice, requires the daily burning of 1,000 souls just to maintain the status quo, just to keep the Imperium functioning at its current level of barely controlled collapse. And somewhere on Hadros Prime in the nutrient processing plant, where I worked before my powers manifested, another child is starting to hear voices, starting to move things with their mind, starting down the path that will end in the hold of a black ship and the chambers beneath Terra, and the final burning that awaits all psychers who cannot serve the Imperium in any other way. The cycle continues. The machine requires feeding. The Emperor hungers, and we burn.